Okay. Hey, everyone. This is Christine. I'm from the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. I'm joined by my colleagues, David Eves and Mitchell Pass, who have been co-leading this initiative called the Community of Practice for DPI Measurement. We're really interested in, one, bringing together the community, but more importantly, diving deeper into the topic of measurement of DPI. Over the past few years, DPI has been a hot topic of sorts, yet there's been definitional issues. There's been gaps in how one organization or one person defines versions of DPI and how other individuals and organizations do. It also affects, most importantly, the adoption journeys of different countries as they try to build population scale infrastructure to deliver digital public services. The goal with this space is to try and, from a research lens and from a policy lens, dive deeper into what do we mean by aspects of DPI as we speak freely about them, and how do we try and create that tangible detail through a lens on measurement. So a lot of questions will be research oriented. How do you measure a certain conceptual feature of DPI? What is a good way to do it? What is a bad way to do it? Are there homogeneous ways to do it? But more importantly, it's to raise questions, hopefully, that haven't been raised before, and treat this as a space for practitioners to come together and learn from each other. With that, I'll pass it over to Mitchell, who will give us an overview of today's topic and speakers who we've invited to talk about their work today. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I'll now provide a brief overview of data stewardship in digital public infrastructure and highlight some of the ways we think it's related to the question of gender inclusion and digital IDs. Hopefully this will set the stage for our expert speakers who will explore these questions in greater depth after me. So I'll begin with providing a kind of brief provisional definition of what we mean by data stewardship in the context of this session, and in the context of the work of the speakers that we've invited today as well. So according to the APTI Institute's Governance Framework report from 2024, data stewardship encompasses the responsible management of data flows throughout the digital infrastructure lifecycle. In this sense, it's about ensuring that data serves public value while protecting individual rights. This understanding of data as an essential feature of digital public infrastructure is important here. Research from Data Privacy Brazil, published just this year, describes digital identity as in their words, gateway to DPI. From this perspective, without proper identity verification, citizens can't access government services, financial systems, or participate meaningfully in the digital economy. So getting data stewardship right is fundamental for ensuring equitable and inclusive digital infrastructure. The centrality of data in determining how inclusive digital infrastructure has also been highlighted by a 2024 report conducted by APTI Institute and MOSIP across Ethiopia, the Philippines, and India, which examined how women interact with digital identity systems. They found that gender served as one of the principal points of data exclusion risks. The report highlighted numerous ways in which specifically gendered exclusion was produced by the design and implementation of certain data governance practices. Whilst this research has focused on global majority contexts, it raises important questions around data and inclusion across DPI maturity contexts that are important to address. And hopefully we can expand the work conducted by APTI Institute and Data Privacy Brazil to address some of these broader questions and not just pigeonhole them within a global majority or an early maturity DPI context. So whilst his research, how does data stewardship address some of these challenges? Some answers to this question would highlight measures such as robust privacy by design and participatory governance practices, which offer a way to develop an inclusive framework for handling data, allowing transparency into the data governance pipeline. What this research makes clear is that gender-inclusive design cannot be an afterthought. It demands that we embed equity considerations into the initial architecture decisions, user research, and implementation challenge strategies. And it's here where I think measurement is important, although it's a latent concept here. I think the question of how we measure these things is really pertinent because they're difficult to measure. Um, so today's speakers will explore these themes from perspectives that highlight both gender inclusion and data stewardship. And bringing these ideas together, we hope we can move towards a more holistic understanding of the broad implications of data stewardship practices as they directly relate to questions of equity and inclusion. So with that, I'll introduce our first round of speakers. I'd like to welcome Asta Kapoor and Kunal Raj Banua from the APTI Institute, and a brief word on APTI. The APTI Institute is a public research institution founded in 2019 and based in Bengaluru, India, that examines lived experiences at the intersection of technology and society. The Institute works on the broad social impacts of emerging technologies with a focus on creating equitable governance frameworks for data stewardship. And with that, I'll let Kunal and Asta take the floor.
Thanks so much, Michelle, for that introduction, and thank you to the UCL team for having us. We've been watching the COP with great interest, and it's really looked like a very vibrant space to have these conversations. I wanted to start off with a bit of a sort of overarching view on our perspective on DPI, particularly gender inclusive DPI. I think that we've all been thinking a lot about what it means to build inclusive DPI, whether it's just a question of adoption, which in countries like India, we've done a really good job of, or whether it's a question of much more sustained usage. And over the last few years, we have been thinking a lot about that question of sustained usage. We have explored models of data stewardship, but I wanted to start with a broader idea of digital trust, which is actually something that we worked on over the last couple of years to understand because in India, I think what we were starting to see was a plateauing of usage. So while, when you reach critical mass in terms of adoption, everybody who has to have a phone has a phone, everyone who has to have Aadhaar has Aadhaar, everyone who has to have a bank account has bank account, because the government and other stakeholders have worked really hard towards driving that adoption. But what we started to realize, I think almost as a collective moment, was that usage of digital platforms wasn't picking up as quickly as it should have. So in conversation with stakeholders and in a 2-year research supported by the Gates Foundation, what we diagnosed actually was that the thing that was missing in very many instances, and especially for women, was the idea of trust. Because we think that infrastructure, as supported, mandated, facilitated by the government, will automatically create trust. What we realized as we hit the ground was that trust is actually a really messy and complicated thing, as it is with people, and you can't bottle it up and put it on platforms. It's also really hard to measure because it changes, it's sporadic, it's negotiated, and it also is not just something that technology companies or platforms can just magically give to people if they put a lock on the top of a website, or they say this transaction is secure or this communication is encrypted. It has to be a much more two-way kind of trust, which is that people give trust to platforms and platforms bring trust back into that relationship. So very, very similar to how we find ways to trust each other. And I think, so we did this work, which is across 4 states in India. I must confess that we went looking for DPI to test trust in DPI. But what we realized is, one, the concept of DPI doesn't necessarily percolate in the field. So when you think about digital public infrastructure, nobody necessarily knows what that means. And also what we realized is that there is a complexity, particularly in India, and maybe it's different in other parts of the world, that the idea of the DPI is so deeply, particularly in like rural India, intertwined with the idea of the state, which is Aadhaar. Right. So the big DPI that you see is Aadhaar. Even outside, urban centers like Bangalore and Delhi, UPI starts to whittle out a little bit. So we did not find that degree of adoption to essentially be able to test what DPI and trust in DPI should be. So we unfortunately had to pull it out and make our research about a broader sense of digital trust, which I still think was quite useful because I don't think this disaggregated sense of human trust in technology is done. There is work, and I know that Bhaskar Chakravarti spoke at the COP, I guess today. So about, and his work on digital trust talks about a very like, how does tech produce trust? And what we were looking at was a much more complicated set of factors. And what we did is we what we call an ontology of trust is that we built this entire ontology of trust to see what are the factors that actually enable women to use technology, because adoption is an imperfect metrics for whether people are able to or not able to use tech. Whereas trust we thought was, and I'll plug this in because it's messy and clunky and not yet launched, so feel free to play around with this work. But if you sort of go into the ontology section of this, I'm not able to figure out how to share my screen. I don't think I'm enabled to do that, but it's fine. If you can just go and play around. And what we realize is that trust is a combination of agency, decision making, and interaction. And this is what happens at every, oh, thank you, at every stage, every transaction of so from downloading an application to making a login and a profile to actually finishing that transaction, each interaction has the ability to have different levers of this ontology come to life. And it's obviously different when it's happening in the context of Aadhaar authentication, and you can measure that differently versus when it's happening for a financial services, tasks such as making a payment. And Rafa and I were recently in together, and we were talking about how trust and financial services, particularly for vulnerable groups, has become a really, really big issue, both in India as well as in Brazil, because of the role that digital public infrastructure in the form of UPI has been playing, in the context of fraud. So they're building trust and resilience and thinking of that as a much more community framework, and thinking about adoption versus and usage and resilience versus just driving numbers is really important. And what we've been thinking about, and the ontology does this as well, is that there are ways to measure adoption. So that is trust building. There are ways to measure trust maintenance. So how do you make sure that people stay in the platform and are able to meaningfully transact in a way that is resilient, in a way that is conscious? And then there is trust repair, which is that what does grievance look like? How do you think about making sure that if trust is ruptured, as is the case in fraud, how do you think that? So this is built for in the context of gender and women in India, but we've been sort of trial ballooning this in different parts of the world, and we feel like this also hits in places like Kenya. We've talked to people in southern parts of Africa, so it also, the ontology sort of makes sense even there, and we're in the process of testing it and nuancing it both for different kinds of transactions as well as different kinds of geographies. I'll pass it on to Kunal, who will be able to talk a little bit more about gender inclusion and MOSIP.
Thanks, Asta. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. But yeah, just to kind of extending some of the conversation that has already been happening, what we were trying to think of was differentiated ways of understanding on-ground realities, in addition to the measurement that's kind of either missing, lacking, or sort of in process. So what we wanted to do was understand how inclusion specifically can be thought about in the case of digital identity systems. And what we were able to kind of build out is an understanding of various different countries, Ethiopia, Philippines, and India in this case. And what we wanted to do was understand or articulate first that there was a difference between adoption and inclusion. So adoption would sort of mean people who have been registered, who have been sort of onboarded onto a system and so on and so forth. But inclusion, I think, should encompass a bit more of a larger understanding access to such systems and their ability to use. So what we ended up creating was this toolkit after almost 2 year research across the 3 countries. And what we were able to do is identify that a lot of inclusion or inclusionary practices technically falter typically at the awareness, access, and usage stages. And what we were able to do is build out this toolkit that addresses a lot of these pitfalls, tries to understand what kind of implications they might have and how they might be remedied or at least mitigated to a certain extent using practices from the globe. So this was kind of our attempt, and I'll share the link just as I finish speaking. But we created this toolkit that we're hoping to deploy with developers, with architects, with country governments to understand how specific types of measurement or specific types of self-assessment can actually determine design choices, can help influence design decisions, and can create inclusion as an actual intentional effort upfront, as opposed to an afterthought or as opposed to sort of like a tweak in the system. Because not only does it have the ability to overcome a lot of societal structures, but what we have seen through our research is that it has the ability to build systems at much more of a scale context, scale ready perspective. And I mean, a lot of help from a lot of people actually who are on this call, and I see a lot of people who we've collaborated with and spoken to over the last few years. And we've also built out our own COP that tries to kind of work with everyone to sort of contextualize this kind of toolkit further and to work more specifically with countries that are trying to build more inclusive digital identities. So over time, what we're hoping to do is contextualize this not just from the gender lens, but from a variety of different lenses, and try and make them hyper context specific to countries that are kind of deploying digital ID systems or even digital public infrastructure in a much larger way. So I think just to sort of tie both the pieces in together, a lot of the user centricity that we are trying to sort of work towards often come from the usage and the perception that exists among users. So how do we incorporate that into system design? What are the learnings that we've already been able to establish, and how do we take these findings and actually inform much more robust and holistic system design is what we've been sort of gearing towards. And now we're at that sort of deployment, embedding, and sort of experimentation stage, and we're hoping to kind of speak to people. And I know some of the co-developed folks here as well doing their inclusivity pulse related work. So yeah, not just looking at singular data protection impact assessments, not just looking at sort of singular types of measurements that help determine, but how do you create a much more robust ecosystem collaborative effort to get a much clearer understanding overall about system perception and system usage. Yeah, that's a little bit of our work. I'll pass it back to you, Christina.
Thank you, Kunal, and thanks, Asa. I can't see you on video anymore, but I think you're in the room. I think what both of you have driven very impressively forward is that inclusion is not only about access, it's also about the quality and usage. And measuring that through adoption is really, really tricky. I can also think of a parallel initiative at the UN Safeguards Initiative that's trying to measure exactly this. And it would be nice to have you guys present the toolkit that you just spoke of, Kunal, somewhere there, because what they're trying to drive at is also trying to come up with a set of indicators that country can treat as an assessment of, how inclusive they are, how they follow certain foundational principles, other than inclusion also. But more importantly, is there a checklist of sorts? Is there something that they need to do at a specific life stage? Because a lot of a pathway towards inclusion, for gender inclusion or a more expansive version of inclusion, is going to evolve as DPI evolves. You don't know what the adoption journey is going to look like in a specific country, and it's more than anything else important to look for signals to adapt the pathway as needed. So it'll be really cool. I'm just packing it as a separate, maybe a parallel presentation to invite you to again. I'm gonna change tracks a little bit and invite Rafa now. When we thought of this session, the focus was data governance, and the first person we approached was Astha because of the impressive work that Apti has done on the topic of data governance. But parallel to it and married to it is how obviously how data governance informs inclusion in ID systems, but also other components of DPI. What we're inviting Rafa to do is to take us back to the data discussion of it all and practices in Brazil. So it's going to seem incoherent for now, but we're going to attempt to bring it all back in the Q&A that follows. So stay with us and with Rafa for the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for an invitation. Thanks to be here, and good to be here, and good to see so many nice faces that I've met before. Kunal, Cristina, Asta, and others, good to see you. Well, I'm one of the directors of Data Privacy Brazil. I'll just briefly say that we are a nonprofit organization based in São Paulo with 28 researchers. There's also a school that has been training public servants from the Data Protection Authority. We will now train more than 100 servants from the Ministry of Social Innovation in next semester on courses on fundamental rights and datafication. And I'm going to share a little bit about one research some researches that we did in the area of governance and regulation regarding digital IDs. We started this work 6 years ago, I would say. And we've been producing a lot of content, not only reports, but also translating that into like podcasts, to open classes, to materials that people can see on Instagram. So our approach is also a multimedia one. We don't like to be stuck in written reports, although we do love long reports, but we try to generate content that can be consumed in many ways. Well, the questions that are here for the seminar are many important questions, but I will try to elaborate a little bit on our work, and maybe the third question here on the difference between nominal inclusion and meaningful inclusion. So I'll just explain what we did and our main findings, and try to elaborate a little bit on the potentials of what Brazil could do to move beyond nominal inclusion. Well, some materials were shared in the email, so you can see the paper that was written and published in the data policy with the team that did this research 4 years ago. We were mapping the informational architecture of the Brazilian national identity system and gov.br, which is a huge success that Brazil is like really proud of. And we've been like the boring guys in the room all of the time, trying to show how they can do better and improve and move beyond problems of exclusion and visibility. So this report here is the first one that we mapped the main risks associated with the gov.br and the national civil identification system, mapping not only like the legal and institutional framework and how it was built in the past, and it's a long process in Brazil, but also mapping potential risks that were not identified by the government when they were designing the gov.br. And we were investigating the risks to fundamental rights in many ways, not only in the informational architecture and the problems of secondary uses of data and how they could violate data protection norms, but also exclusionary consequences regarding elderly people, even children, or transgender community, and the lack of a data protection impact assessment, which was attacked by us as a big problem. Now the government is improving and they are producing data protection impact assessments, but back then, 4 years ago, they were not doing this. So the work was important to push the government towards the right direction. Well, one of the problems that we identified is that without a birth certificate, you cannot be inside the informational architecture. So there is a problem in North and Northeast of Brazil regarding people that do not have this kind of documentation. Therefore, they're completely excluded from the whole system. This is one basic element. You can find more about this topic in the report that is shared on page from 60 to 70. We explore that in depth. And we also investigated problems of the compatibility of secondary uses of the data inside the system, and how the government was not prepared to have like a methodology to understand properly if the secondary uses of data were attached to the norms of purpose, limitation, and adequacy, and what is now an obligation for policymakers because of the data protection law. I would also like to point that the fundamental right to data protection is now a constitutional right in Brazil that was included in the constitution 2 years ago. Therefore, it's not only a matter of complying with the federal legislation, but it's also like a positive obligation of the state because of constitutional requirements. And this was a huge win from civil society. And we've been using this argument in constitutional terms to change policy. Well, the report then mapped some risks of the architecture and the governance, so a lack of democratic and multi-sectoral governance because of the design of the system and how it was managed, the problems of potential secondary uses and sharing of personal data. We now just did a new report and we pressured the governments together with Internet Lab and EDAC on a potential use of secondary data from the systems that they want to do to map potential beneficiaries of Bolsa Familia and other like cash transfer mechanisms that might be used for political purposes. And we've been pressuring them very hard. They did a step back, changed the federal decree, and now we'll do an impact assessment. So we've been really pushy on the issue of like the potential uses of secondary of the data in the systems with a little bit of success. And we also mapped problems of, as Asta said, what can happen in terms of frauds, and if you have that kind of biometric data being used for like social engineering schemes or scams or any other financial harm that can affect Brazilians. And this is happening. I will show a little bit of some data that is pointing to that. And then we identified many kinds of risks and which fundamental rights were associated. That is in the report. I will not go into every one of them because there's a lot. And I'll just point to the problem of gender because this was one of the questions. So what we pointed was also the problems for transgender people in Brazil. And I would like to say that they're also, this is a really important community. You know, Brazil has two Congress people that are part of the transgender community for the very first time. So this was a risk that was pointed, and we directed the report to this community so they could do the policy work as well. As you know, even Erika Hilton, who's this person here, a Congress person, now is facing problems with the Trump administration regarding like the visa, and has been declared as like male gender, and now the Brazilians are fighting against the US on that. So I'll just point that this is a very sensitive topic for this community here in Brazil. And now, of course, gov.br changed because you can include the social name in your identity system, and you can do that through gov.br. So this was something that we pointed 4 years ago, and they changed it later to improve it and to make sure that people can include the social name. And the risks of exclusion, is, as we point in the report, are of course people that are without identity documents in the north and northeast, trans individuals facing those kind of barriers for the recognition of the social name, elderly people that are facing like digital literacy issues, and people without like stable internet access that can be affected in a harmful way because they cannot have like reliable internet access and use gov.br in a reliant way. And now we are facing a lot of risks of scams and digital frauds. Gov.br just reached 166 million users in Brazil, and it's the most accessed government platform in the world, according to official data. And now criminals are using scams and building really similar platforms as gov.br, using AI and other systems to make people make false loans or open credit in their names. So this is exploding this year. So in the same time that you have the success of gov.br, you have the huge increase of scams and digital frauds that we're mapping this year. This is our priority this year. We are working on digital frauds and scams as a key priority in 2025, because we know this is going to be a huge problem and it's only going to increase. and the government is not prepared to map the consequences of the success of gov.br. So this has been discussed in the media, in main newspapers in Brazil, this dilemma of being a success and being under attack at the same time. So just to conclude in 1 minute and a half or 2 minutes, if you allow me, Cristina, to move beyond nominal inclusion, of course, Brazilian approach has been mainly on nominal inclusion, like just mapping the number of users, celebrating the number of users, etc. We don't have any kind of approach by the government to do meaningful inclusion methodology to map and measure, combining not only quantitative data, but also qualitative data on what are the impacts for those people. They do not do like focal groups. They do not do like big surveys on what is the impact for the community, how they perceive frauds, how they perceive problems of using the system for the wrong purposes, and so on. We could map, like, if we want to go beyond nominal inclusion, we could explore like potential indicators and questions that they could do by survey, asking citizens like, do you trust that the government uses the biometric data only for the purpose? Can you log in and use the gov.br without any kind of assistance? Does gov.br allow you to be identified by your social name? Have you been denied any kind of benefit? Or did you have any kind of problem? So these kind of questions are not being asked to the population to measure, the meaningful element of agency and autonomy. And if we focus on gender, we could even go further and ask if for women and people using the platform, if they have problems of like being obliged to log in on gov.br to get credit because you're being like pressured by your partner. So a lot of domestic violence could be combined as well with the benefits of gov.br. And the government is not prepared to map and measure that. We don't have any kind of empirical research, as far as I know, that is looking to these problems and asking these kind of questions. So what we're doing is we are defending this rights-based approach to DPI in Brazil. We're defending this data justice approach in which government could use surveys or focus groups to move beyond the quantitative element of number of users. And I think there's an opportunity here because I think many of the policymakers from Brazil, from MGI, from ENAP, from Ministry of Economy, they need support from specialized think tanks and research groups as yourselves. And I think there's room here to develop like a common taxonomy or a methodology for empirical research that they could build upon. One thing that they love is that they do like to know like what has been working in other institutions, like if the World Bank has done something like that, or if the government of India or Kenya. So all these concrete examples that could be transferred to those policymakers are really useful. And if you need any support from my side to do that bridging, do count on me because this is a priority for us. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rafa. And thanks for also paying so much attention to the research questions and answering them so thoroughly. It gave us a lot to think about in terms of measurement. And my reactions, I don't know, all the hearts and the rockets and the celebrations I sent was also because the measurement issues is what what the DPI mapping project has been dealing with for a while from the supply side of things, but now increasingly the Inclusive Pulse, I bet the Inclusion Hub project that Kunal took us through are also wrestling with very similar questions around measuring what matters. And the table you shared really gave us an overview of what these questions could look like, but also how challenging it is to get data on this. So to bring it back to the discussion, there's a lot of themes that came up today, and that's partly because I think we have speakers and participants in the room who come with a lot of specialist experience in pockets that are related. So we started with the data governance topic. How much does data matter to the DPI discussion? And what do governance models around data, how do they affect DPI governance models at large? Very intricately tied to that is the concept of digital trust. And Mitchell talked a little bit about data trust, which is one way to exemplify the concept of trust in the context of data. But digital trust is more broad. Astha mentioned the two-way relationship between not only individuals and citizens that need to garner trust in order to see if they want to share their data. But it goes both ways. The institution also needs to imbibe trust. One, it can't be taken for granted. It's not a static concept. It needs to be built continuously. All of these things mean it becomes increasingly difficult to measure. And then finally, we're coming to gender inclusion. The way I see it is that it becomes a litmus test to see if digital trust is working, and foundations and a rights-based approach that is really institutionalized through data governance mechanisms. Is it really working? Is it passing the litmus test of including people at the margins, more specifically women and children, but also the transgender community? And thanks for pointing out very specific examples, Rafa, because something that I stayed with is how much of this needs to rest in a legal code versus what are operational measures that governments or countries can take, because legal frameworks take time to find their ground and find their footing. In the meantime, what are governments meant to do who are pursuing the inclusion agenda through data governance means, but also through larger DPI governance means? I'm sure that's a question that, Kunal, you can address also, given the toolkit. So I'm going to leave that open if anyone wants to react to that quickly. And while you do that, I'm going to collect questions from the chat. Rafa, maybe you want to go first?
I don't know. I really don't have answers for that. And would be great to hear, I don't know, maybe more questions or more reflections, because also for us, it's an opportunity to, you know, learn from your high expertise. We are just beginning this new phase of the project in Data Privacy Brazil, trying to push towards this new direction on new problems for the meaningful access dimension, you know, and we're still looking for benchmarks and other experiences that are relevant. So please, if you have any comments, I'll be glad to.
Posing a slightly different question and pivoting slightly away from what Christina's just highlighted. I wonder if any of you could say more about the measurement opportunities, but also gaps associated with attempting to model out or push back against like a top-down model of data infrastructure. It seems to me that there's kind of like this funnel or like inclination towards like a top-down model, just because like it makes everything so much easier and like more convenient for like infrastructure design and build out. Like it makes things easier to measure, it makes all of the information easier to capture. So I think, yeah, like the survey which you signaled, Rafa, was like really useful for my thinking on that topic. So I wonder if any of you have got more to say there, or like more strategies or models for measuring more kind of distributed and kind of bottom up models of data trust, data governance that we might think together.
I can jump in, and again, we got derailed by digital trust and didn't focus enough on data trust. But I think that there are opportunities for bottom-up models of data stewardship. We've been doing a lot of work around data co-ops, which is that people who are already organized in cooperatives are pooling in their labor and capital. Is it possible for them to also pool in data and govern that collectively? And cooperatives offer a nice method of, one member, one vote. There's a board that has a fiduciary responsibility towards its members. However, what we found is that in the context of bottom-up data stewardship, and maybe Mitchell, this is a bit different from what you were asking in terms of much more bottom-up understanding of data itself. Bottom-up data stewardship is complicated, it's time-consuming, and I think demonstrating the value of data in our estimate is that takes about 3 to 4 days of very concentrated effort with communities to start to demonstrate the value of data to them. And so you have to do this at each community and meet them where their lived experiences are. We do work with women in agricultural co-ops, and so the value of data and stewarding that data becomes, things like access to better financial services. We've been doing some work at the intersection of gender and climate and data, where we've been looking at mechanisms for bottom-up sovereignty in Southeast Asia, where people are using, the data generated by their communities for, negotiating around carbon credits or getting better access to information on fishing. So there are models. In terms of a more sort of measurement perspective, when it comes to co-ops, we think that there's an opportunity to do this through the federated structure of co-ops. So for instance, anybody who knows India, Amul is like the largest milk cooperative in the country. And so if we were able to steward data through the cooperative federation structure, which is how milk flows up and, instructions flow down, that could be an interesting way of doing it. The issue is that in the context of DPI and data as infrastructure, there are multiple ways to cut this. One is what happens to the data that is generated from the use of DPI. We don't have a good answer to that, right? So we don't know where all the transaction data goes. Every time I authenticate, I imagine that the data goes to UIDAI, but the return of value from that data is unclear. So I'm not even sure how we could steward that, given that it seems to be a highly centralized function. Similarly, when it comes to financial services, every time I transact on UPI in India, which is owned by Google or run by Google, all the transaction data is being, is with Google. And we've tried to figure this out as well, which is that every transaction, and Google also on Google Pay encourages you to label it. So you're basically also giving them a little bit of your labor while you're also giving them away your data in all of this. So, it is in the context of DPI, the way that it is currently structured, it is very hard to think about much more bottom-up mechanisms of stewarding data that is generated off DPI. However, there are newer models, which, I've seen, and, you guys, maybe there's LocOS, which is an SHG level model that the Gates Foundation is building, which is for the SHG secretary to digitize SHG data. And over time, there is opportunity to return value back to SHG members in the same sort of frame as a co-op. It's very far from that imagination at the moment, but given the way that DPI are structured, I don't fully understand how bottom-up mechanisms of stewardship might come. We may be able to create alternative data infrastructures that can pull off some of the DPI, data created off DPIs. But like I said, like in the context of co-ops, etc., which will just be transaction data of the collective, etc. But I don't fully see how that might happen as of right now. Rafa, I know you had a comment in the chat.
Yeah, my comment is on a different tone, but it's kind of a contradiction that we perceive in Brazil, is that the only institution that is really focused on building this kind of indicators and mapping the usage dimension of technologies is the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, which is like a multi-stakeholder governance body, which is not part of the state officially. And they've been conducting excellent research in the past 30 years, especially through CETIC, which is like the Center on Studies on Information Technologies. It's the best one in the country. But we don't see like the federal government interested in doing that kind of measurement yet. Like, and the reaction that when we present this to ENAPI and the School of Public Administration, and we've been advocating for a data justice approach, their reaction is like, okay, we like it, but how can we make it practical and operationalize it quickly? How can we build like a strong theory of value of how it's valuable and doable, and instruct policymakers to do it? So they are afraid of like experimenting and building new stuff without clear references or examples of how it worked I don't know, in the World Bank or in other institutions that you have this kind of conditionalities imposed, and you need to measure through qualitatively. So I think they're really focused on like building a case of success. Like we have more than 4,500 services online. We have 165 million users using gov.br. So it's really hard to push them in the other direction.
If I could just add, I think what was interesting for us during our ID study was the formalization or recognizing of intermediaries that exist in just in terms of like becoming part of the system for measurement, course correction, and so on as well. So a lot of the CSOs, community-based entities that exist that either provide complementary or supportive services also tend to actually become a very essential part of the entire chain. And what tends to happen is that sort of not including them in the design process or consultative process ends up actually reducing the consolidated perception going up. I think what ends up happening is that people's perceptions tend to stay sort of fragmented. They don't actually make their way to the top. So a lot of these community-based entities kind of bring up a lot of these points. And that's kind of where our COP also focused, was to consolidate using some of the perspectives of community-based entities to bring up that point as well. And this is again similar to the point I was making around alternative forms of measurement, but essentially, how do you think about using the folks that exist in the middle, using the entities that exist in the middle to create a dual purpose reflexive feedback loop that allows for better insights going up towards the designers and builders, but also how do you create a sort of capacity awareness builder on the way down, just to ensure that it's getting triggered into a much larger form of impact downstream as well. So we observe that a lot in Ethiopia and Philippines, and they do it through a variety of different types of mechanisms and intermediaries. But again, just because the relationship is maybe not as clearly articulated, even if not defined, that it ends up becoming a bit tougher to sort of continuously use that loop in a meaningful manner. But it does help. And I think there was a conversation that DPBR, APTI, we had, I think, in RightsCon 2023 about the impact of data protection impact assessments. And I think from there on, it's just been a pretty big opening up of like alternative forms of measurement as well.
Thank you for that. It's evoking a question on DPIAs. Both Asta and Rafa brought it up as one of the methods to measure, but simultaneously critiqued its utility in giving us useful impact data and data on what works and what doesn't. It would be nice to see if you can dive deeper into that, because DPIAs, or data protection impact assessments, seem to be a sort of templatized version to try and understand, is data being protected, to what outcome, more and more. And in the absence of any other benchmark, it's being used. It would be nice to explicitly discuss how it's being useful or not being useful. But before we do that, I'm gonna invite Vanitha. You have your hand up, and thanks for joining us again, Vanitha. Go for it.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks to the speakers today. I guess because this is a community of practice that looks to measure some of the language, and I know data justice was spoken about by Rafael, but some of the language does seem a little bit depoliticized. I think especially in the Indian context, when we say adoption was, especially for welfare entitlements, coercion. It was a necessary condition to receive your welfare benefits. And so if we are measuring DPI from a perspective of public trust, or even what adoption was, what would then criteria be over there is something I think we should be speaking a bit more about, because it is a deeply political question. I can speak for India, because my research is on digitalization in India, and it was something that was contested up to the Supreme Court level, and it was then allowed and made mandatory in for all effective purposes. And so I think, speaking to this, to Raphael's point, and bringing in also the Indian context, when we do talk about measuring DPI, I think it is extremely important then to consider the politics of some of the criteria that we are discussing, because even adoption is highly depoliticized as a term. Or what does it mean to have access? Access is not solely getting a benefit, it is dignity in the process, how long you had to wait for it, what does building trust or repairing it mean in a context where some benefit more than others from the starting point, and that is replicated in a digital context. So yeah, I just wanted to throw up some of the, it's not a question, obviously, but since I see this as a community of practice, I just wanted to raise some of these points, because I feel some of the terms have been discussed without bringing in the politics of DPI too. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanita. You bring up a very important question. We're going to have to dedicate a whole session to it. But just the idea of discussing adoption as the proxy for digital trust, because from the supply side of things, that's what it means. When governments are trying to measure if DPI is working, they check if it's adopted, and they conflate adoption for trust, forgetting that often it is a pathway of coercion that leads to adoption, and people often have no choice other than to adopt. But do they want to use it, and to what outcome is a separate question. I think, Asta, you raised your hand to react to this question, so I'll let you go before David, if that's okay, Dave, and then we come back.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in to agree with that. I don't think that the language, or at least in the way that we have looked at DPI, or a lot of other people who have been looking at DPI, like there is no depoliticization of the language, just a cognizance of what you can and cannot politicize in this environment. But I think that that's also why we were making the point that adoption is not a reasonable measure of trust, and trust is a much more broader set of factors. And which is also the point I was making, is that the only DPI that you really can find in different parts of India, and the one that has the 1 billion number attached to it, is Aadhaar, which was what was mandated by the government of India over the last 12 years. So all the others, whether it's Open or ONDC is seeing drop-offs after the mandates have changed. UPI, they're bringing back MDR because sustainability is not an issue. So we're going to see drop fraud. That's the other thing, which is, an adoption issue at this point. So what the government does is it cannibalizes public trust and puts it into different parts of the digital ecosystem. And that's what sometimes sustains it. But in other instances, beyond ID, MDR is merchant discount rate, which is the transaction cost that is there on payments. So agreed, Vanita, with your point, but only to clarify that none of this is depoliticized, as we've said many times. I think that this is very much where the lived experiences of people, and having to negotiate with an increasingly absconding state that is sort of digitalizing its interface with citizens, but also in the context of trust and bringing that back, is that what we have tried to uncover and have been trying to also see how we can embed this back into the design of schemes and programs and delivery and deployment of digital infrastructure, is how do you think of that centricity? How do you move from that agency to actually pressing the button and making the transaction. And that is a very complex set of factors that includes your own, things like your own confidence, your ability to validate the transaction. So it could be functional things, and or others could be very, very embedded in your community. Like, I mean, the idea that most Indian women have shared devices. This is a pretty basic thing, which is not at all discussed. And the way that identity programs, payments are all designed is one person, one device. It doesn't map like that in messy places like India. So you have instances where the OTP is going to the husband and you're standing at the ration shop trying to uptake your grains, and it just doesn't work, right? So yes, there are complexities, and this is a political issue. And I think that a lot of the critiques that or conversations that Rafa brought up, as well as the stuff that we've been trying to straddle, is very aware of that. And it's just that the scale of the problem, or rather scale of the rollout, and we've all been part of the Supreme Court cases and everything since. I think that the focus needs to be on how do we think about much more user-centric design, because the rollback, rework, all of that, I think is at the moment not possible. And obviously the work that you guys are doing with UCL and thinking about what it looks like in other parts of the world, I think that's where some of these conversations can come up.
Thanks, Asta. Dave?
Yeah, this is a very selfish question from the maps perspective. I love this conversation, and I think one of the challenges is like the diversity of things one would need to measure, and the kind of idiosyncratic things one would need to measure on a kind of country by country or region by region basis to establish this as like highly diverse. And so here on the map, we have this fairly blunt tool that doesn't feel like it fully honors the richness of this conversation. And so I guess one question I'd have is there one thing we could be trying to measure that would serve as an indicator or a flag or a help? Like, what's the thing we could try to measure with our very blunt approach that would be helpful to all of you, if anything? But that would be, I would love thoughts on that. It doesn't have to be right now because I know we're low on time.
Well,
let me ask you something. Are you somehow measuring those unintended consequences of DPIs? Like as in this dilemma of Brazil, like the success of gov.br is producing these huge market incentives for organized crime to explore frauds, for instance. So if there's any kind of way to measure those unintended consequences, because it's happening, right?
We're really just measuring the prevalence. So we're measuring what systems, processes, policies, what exists that qualifies something to be a DPI. But we're not measuring outcomes in the map. We're not going in and being like, here's what the impact is. But so, for example, like around gender, one could, in theory, if it was measured, one could, in theory, say, okay, well, we would maybe have an indicator that was gender oriented, looking at like adoption rates across gender, assuming one could get the data that we could easily find across every country. But that would be even just doing that is an incredibly high lift. Like that's a non-trivial lift. So it's more like we have baseline information that I would like to would be helpful. Can it be helpful indicator to people to be like, oh yeah, here's a place that's likely to have similar problems as to this other place.
go for it, Benita.
I was waiting for if anybody else wants to say, but in response to your question, Dave, I wonder whether something along the lines of a feedback mechanism, right? So, but a functional one. I mean, having worked with governments in India, I know that we have feedback mechanisms where nobody is looking at the complaints that come in, or the grievances that are left hanging and in limbo. And so something along the lines of DPI linked a feedback loop, if this has been designed and deployed. Next step would be what kind of feedback processing is happening, perhaps just as off the top of my head. I don't know.
That's useful. Yeah. I think that's was the starting point, and that's what we have been tracking. A feedback mechanism could be a form, it could be a toll-free number, it could also be something more interventionist if the government has the capacity to address. But we've only been able to track the supply of it in the sense of does it exist? On the back end, is someone looking at the feedback? Is someone enforcing the mandate, the legal mandate for someone to look at that feedback and do something with it? Not tracked. And it's difficult to track because different governments rely on feedback in different ways. So it's an open question. And thanks, Rafa. Do give it thought. We will, hopefully in the pre-read, in the follow-up resource, we'll write back with some of the questions or address some of the questions on how the map does it. We're very aware it's not the perfect way. It's the version we have right now. The goal is to improve this with feedback from this group. So if we do arrive at a common metric that's different from the one we use right now, we would like to adapt how the map collects data against it and at least arrive at, as David put it, a blunt version of how countries across the world do it to then get more specific and nuanced and have an adapted view towards measuring certain indicators. With that, I'll pause. We're already above time. Thanks to everyone who joined us and more so could stay beyond the hour. The notes and the recording will go through to everyone who registered, and we look forward to seeing you at follow-up sessions. A short note is this is very much a community. If you want to host a follow-up session, please get in touch. We'd love to use this as a space to showcase your work and discuss questions you haven't had the space to discuss elsewhere. So please write to Mitchell, write to me or Dave or anyone here that you see on video or off video. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much, and especially to Rafa and Kunal and to Apti as a whole. And thanks for everyone who participated. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everyone.